The village of Stoke Haven lay beneath a delicate frost that sparkled like powdered sugar in the soft morning light. Smoke rose in slender spirals from chimneys, carrying the scent of peat and burning logs into the crisp winter air. The cobbled streets were largely deserted, save for the occasional postman, bundled against the cold, and a pair of children, cheeks red, huddled over a sled as it skidded unevenly down a gentle slope. Even in its stillness, the village seemed alive with a quiet energy that only Christmas Eve could bestow. At the heart of Stoke Haven stood St. John's Vicarage, a dignified Georgian house, its ivy, clad facade softened by the frost. Candles flickered in the windows, casting warm pools of light across the garden path, and the faint tinkle of the vicar's piano floated out as Mrs. Martha Pendlebury rehearsed her carols. It was a place both welcoming and orderly, much like its inhabitants, who prided themselves on their decorum and gentle propriety. Miss Jane Marple arrived at the vicarage that morning, stepping carefully over the icy doorstep, her sensible boots crunching against the frozen gravel. Though her stature was diminutive and her appearance unassuming, a small woman with silvery hair neatly pinned back, spectacles perched on her nose, there was a perceptive glint in her pale blue eyes that hinted at an intellect always at work. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Pendlebury from the doorway, her voice sweet but carrying a trace of nervous energy. She was a woman of medium height, her dark hair streaked with grey, eyes a sharp green that missed nothing, and a smile that never quite reached the corners of her mouth. "I'm so glad you've come early this year. We have so much to prepare for the Christmas service, and Theodore, oh, you know how he fusses over every detail." Miss Marple smiled politely, adjusting her woolen scarf. "Fussing, my dear Martha, is sometimes the sign of someone who cares, though I dare say even fussing must have its limits." Her voice was soft, almost conversational, yet carried a subtle humour that put Martha slightly at ease. The vicar, Reverend Theodore Pendlebury, appeared from the study behind them. He was a tall, thin man with a gentle, solemn face, the kind that inspired both respect and a slight reserve. His eyes, a pale grey, seemed to consider every detail before he spoke. "Ah, Jane, it's wonderful to have you again," he said warmly, stepping forward with an outstretched hand. "Christmas at the vicarage is never quite the same without your insightful company." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I shall do my best to provide insight, Reverend, though, naturally, one never knows what mysteries Christmas might bring." She allowed her gaze to wander, as if deliberately noting the placement of the holly, the precise angle of the candle holders, and the slight disorder in the teacups left from morning preparations. Inside, the vicarage was cosy yet spacious, furnished with the kind of taste that suggested long family tradition. Dark oak panels lined the walls, and a large fireplace dominated the sitting room, its mantel decorated with sprigs of holly and clusters of red berries. Mrs. Pendlebury bustled about, arranging sugar tongs, silver teapots, and plates of biscuits, while Miss Marple made herself comfortable in a winged armchair. "Tea, Miss Marple?" Martha asked, pouring hot water over fragrant leaves. "Thank you, my dear. Just a splash of milk, if you please," Miss Marple replied, settling in. She poured the tea slowly, her eyes observing the minor details of her surroundings, details that often revealed far more than they seemed. The peaceful scene, however, was subtly disturbed by the arrival of a few villagers who were expected for the traditional Christmas Eve gathering. Edward Harcourt, the local solicitor, entered with a confident air, his tailored coat brushing the carpet. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he carried an air of urbane self-assurance. Though polite, there was a slight hardness to his eyes, a vigilance that suggested he was always assessing, always measuring. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a nod, Delighted to see you. Stoke Haven is infinitely more charming when one has company that appreciates it." There was a faint note of flattery in his tone, as though aware of Miss Marple's reputation for discernment. Captain Lionel Trench, recently retired from the Royal Navy, followed shortly. His military bearing was unmistakable, erect posture, sharp eyes, a deliberate gait. He greeted no one effusively, simply inclining his head. There was a gruffness about him, and he had the habit of observing people with a quiet intensity that made some villagers uncomfortable. Finally, Florence Green, the village gossip, arrived, cheeks flushed from the cold. She was small, sprightly, and nosy, with an unerring ability to overhear conversations not intended for her ears. Behind her cheerful chatter lurked an observant mind that rarely missed any of the village's comings and goings. With the formal introductions made, the group settled around the sitting-room. Miss Marple sipped her tea, listening to the murmur of conversation, noting each glance, each small gesture. Villagers may have thought her merely a kindly elderly woman, but she had a way of drawing out truths, unearthing secrets with the gentlest of inquiries. It was during the second cup of tea that the first unease of the evening became apparent. Martha, attempting to maintain composure, fumbled slightly with a folded letter that had arrived earlier in the post. She glanced nervously at her husband, and with a faint blush set it aside. "Anything the matter, Martha?" Reverend Pendlebury asked, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, nothing, Theodore," she replied quickly. "Just a letter from an old acquaintance, nothing to trouble anyone." But Miss Marple, observing from her armchair, detected the tremor in her hands and the slight tightening of her lips. Before anyone could press the matter, a sudden commotion drew them toward the window. Agnes Blythe, the young housemaid, was standing outside in the frosty yard, her face pale. "Miss Marple, Reverend, you must come quickly," she cried, her voice quivering. "It's Mr. Harcourt. He's fallen in the garden." The entire room tensed. Miss Marple set down her tea with deliberate calm. "Calmly, everyone. Let us see what has happened before leaping to conclusions." The group hurried outside. The garden, usually pristine, was a landscape of icy paths and frost-covered hedges. Edward Harcourt lay sprawled on the stone pathway, eyes closed, a slight red stain at the side of his temple. It was not an altogether violent scene. No blood spattered across the pristine snow, but the way he had fallen suggested something sudden and unplanned. Captain Trench knelt beside him. "He's alive, but unconscious," he said. "Perhaps he tripped on the ice," Miss Marple observed quietly, "or perhaps not." She murmured more to herself than anyone else. She noticed the faint scuff marks by the garden gate, the slight disturbance of a flower-bed near the stone path, and the absence of any other footprints aside from those of the bystanders. The scene was too deliberate to be merely accidental. Within minutes Harcourt was carefully brought inside, laid upon a settee, and attended to by Mrs. Pendlebury, who dabbed a damp cloth against his brow. He regained consciousness slowly, his expression one of confusion and slight alarm. I must have slipped," he stammered, but Miss Marple's sharp gaze was upon him. She noticed his hand slightly trembling and the subtle sheen of sweat on his brow. There was an almost imperceptible tension in his jaw, a rigidity that suggested awareness more acute than mere surprise. Later that evening, after Harcourt had retired to his room for rest, the villagers gathered in the sitting-room once more. There was a quiet unease. Even Florence Green, who had expected a cosy evening of carols and mince pies, seemed unsettled, her usual chatter subdued. Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea, her thoughts quietly assembling the pieces. "There is something more here than a simple slip on the icy path," she reflected. A village as small and as tightly knit as Stoke Haven rarely sees accidents without reason. She glanced around the room, noting the villagers' reactions. Captain Trench's furrowed brow, Reverend Pendlebury's anxious glances toward his wife, Florence Green's darting eyes, and even Agnes Blythe's hesitant stance near the hearth. Each face told a story, each gesture a subtle clue, and then, almost imperceptibly, Martha Pendlebury cleared her throat and spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "There is something I should tell you," she said, hesitating. "Something I should have mentioned earlier. It concerns a confession, one that may explain Mr. Harcourt's fall, or perhaps complicate matters further." All eyes turned toward her, and even Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill of anticipation. It was the sort of moment she had long observed in village life, the precise instant when ordinary lives intersected with extraordinary secrets. Thus Stokehaven's seemingly peaceful Christmas Eve had begun its descent into intrigue, and Miss Marple, comfortably ensconced in her chair, knew that the evening held more than mere carols and mince pies. Somewhere in the warmth of the vicarage, beneath the twinkling holly and polished silver, a mystery was waiting to be unravelled, and Miss Marple, as always, would be the one to see it through. The following morning dawned clear but bitterly cold. A thin layer of frost clung to the branches of the yew trees, and the chimneys of Stokehaven's cottages puffed steadily against the pale blue sky. Inside the vicarage, Miss Marple rose with quiet determination. She was accustomed to early hours, and the events of the previous evening, the sudden fall of Edward Harcourt and Martha Pendlebury's cryptic hint, had set her mind in motion. Breakfast was a subdued affair. Reverend Pendlebury's eyes were heavy with concern, and Mrs. Pendlebury moved with careful precision, pouring tea as if trying to maintain order in a household suddenly unsettled. Captain Trench had stationed himself near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the frost-coated garden. Florence Green chattered nervously about minor village matters, but the usual gossipy sparkle in her eyes was dimmed. Miss Marple, sipping her tea, took stock of her companions. Edward Harcourt had returned from his room, looking pale but composed. He moved with a certain stiffness, favouring his left leg slightly, and kept glancing at the vicar as though uncertain how to address the prior incident. Agnes Blythe hovered discreetly near the door, eyes wide and hesitant, as if she anticipated some revelation she was not yet ready to witness. "Shall we discuss what happened yesterday?" Miss Marple suggested lightly, though her tone carried an underlying insistence. "It may save us from unnecessary speculation." Reverend Pendlebury hesitated. I think it was an accident. Edward tripped on the icy path while walking to the garden gate. I've checked. Well, there was some frost, but nothing that should have caused such a fall." Miss Marple's gaze lingered thoughtfully on him. "A simple fall often looks accidental, Theodore, but sometimes the simplest appearances conceal a more complex truth." She took another sip of tea and glanced at Martha, whose hands were folded tightly in her lap. I suppose," Martha murmured, voice faint, "it could have been nothing, but there was a letter from a solicitor in London. Edward received it yesterday morning. He was rather agitated by it, though he would not speak of its contents." Miss Marple's eyes flickered. "Ah, and what did this letter contain?" Martha shook her head. "I do not know. He would not show me. I only know that he seemed troubled and distant. It was unlike him, especially at Christmas." Miss Marple made a mental note. Letters and documents often held as much significance in a village as whispered words, sometimes more. After breakfast, she decided to begin her investigation in earnest. Stokehaven was a small village, and information moved quickly through its channels, often arriving unbidden at the doorstep of anyone perceptive enough to notice it. Miss Marple started with the vicar himself, whose mind was weighed down by the responsibilities of his parish. "Tell me, Reverend," she asked gently as they walked toward the study, "have you noticed any recent tensions among the villagers? Disagreements, perhaps, that might seem trivial but could reveal deeper unrest?" Pendlebury paused, hands behind his back, his brow furrowed. "Nothing of great consequence, though, now that you mention it, there have been some minor disputes over the church fete preparations. Edward Harcourt has been particularly insistent on certain matters. Some villagers find him overbearing, I fear." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see. It is often in matters of insistence, of small disagreements, that the seeds of more serious conflict may lie." She made a mental note to observe Harcourt's interactions more closely. Next, she spoke privately with Captain Trench. The retired officer had always struck Miss Marple as someone who noticed more than he let on. His military habits gave him a natural attention to detail. "Captain," she began, "you were in the garden when Mr. Harcourt fell. Did you notice anything unusual, any footprints, or perhaps another presence?" Trench's eyes narrowed. "I saw nothing unusual. There were only the prints of Edward's boots and my own. The frost was thin, and the pathway was icy, yet it was an odd fall, too neat, almost as if he'd been nudged or startled." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. "Exactly what I suspected. And do you know of anyone who might wish to startle him?" Trench shook his head. "No. Edward is well liked, though some envy his position. Not enough to resort to mischief." Miss Marple filed this information away, considering the possibility that a subtle, indirect act might have caused the fall. Poison, distraction, or a timed misstep could all be employed with minimal evidence. Later in the morning she spoke with Florence Green, who had returned from her early rounds of village observation. Florence's eyes gleamed with a mixture of excitement and caution. "Miss Marple, I have news," she exclaimed, lowering her voice. "I heard from Mrs. Dobson that Edward had a quarrel with someone from London just last week. Apparently some old business about land or inheritance. He's kept it under wraps, but people are talking." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And who precisely might have had a grievance against him?" Florence shrugged. "I'm not certain. That's why people are whispering. But it does make one wonder if this letter he received yesterday had something to do with it." Agnes Blythe, the housemaid, was the next person Miss Marple interviewed. The girl was timid but observant. Miss Marple approached gently, understanding that young people often witnessed more than they realized. "Agnes, did you notice anything unusual yesterday before Mr. Harcourt's fall?" she asked. The girl hesitated. "Well, I saw Mr. Harcourt walking to the garden, and he looked troubled. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting someone, and then, when he fell, I thought, perhaps he wasn't paying attention, but—" She trailed off, clearly reluctant to speak further. Miss Marple leaned in kindly. "You may trust me, Agnes. Everything you saw may be important." Agnes nodded, taking a breath. He dropped something when he fell. A small object. I didn't see what it was, but it skittered under the hedge. I didn't think to pick it up." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Very good, Agnes. That is a detail worth noting indeed. I shall examine the garden later." By mid-morning, Miss Marple had a clearer sense of the possible motives and tensions. Edward Harcourt was evidently troubled by correspondence from London, perhaps relating to old business or inheritance matters. Captain Trench's observations suggested that the fall might not have been purely accidental. Florence Green's gossip pointed to potential grudges, and Agnes's testimony hinted at a small object that might be crucial. Miss Marple also noted subtler tensions within the vicarage itself. Martha Pendlebury's anxiety suggested she knew more than she admitted, while her husband's attempts at calm reflected both concern and a desire to protect his household. The very act of secrecy, Miss Marple knew, often indicated knowledge of delicate truths. After a light lunch, Miss Marple took the opportunity to inspect the garden. The frost had begun to soften slightly under the weak winter sun. but the pathway remained treacherous. She examined the stone path where Harcourt had fallen, crouching low to inspect scuff marks and indentations in the frost. Her practised eye noted several points. The footprints showed a hesitation in Harcourt's step before the fall, a pause as if startled. There was a faint, almost imperceptible depression near the flower-bed, as if a small object had been kicked or dropped. The hedge under which Agnes claimed the object had disappeared was slightly disturbed, suggesting movement. Miss Marple straightened, fingers steepled. The fall was not purely accidental. Something, or someone, prompted it. Returning inside, she called for Edward Harcourt under the guise of casual conversation. She observed him carefully as he sat by the fire, fingers nervously twisting a napkin. "Edward," she began, "do you recall what you were thinking just before you stepped onto the path yesterday?" Harcourt glanced at her, startled. I was considering a letter. I must admit I was distracted, but nothing else. No one was near me." Miss Marple nodded. "Distraction can indeed lead to missteps, though sometimes external forces create the illusion of distraction. Did you notice anything unusual on the path itself?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, nothing that I remember." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, allowing silence to settle. Villagers often underestimated the importance of careful observation, but Miss Marple had long since learned that even the smallest detail, an object dropped, a glance exchanged, could unravel an entire web of secrets. By the afternoon she had completed her preliminary investigation. Notes and mental observations aligned in her mind. Edward Harcourt, anxious about a letter, possibly threatened by past business dealings. Captain Trench observed the fall, noted oddness in its execution. Florence Green, aware of gossip regarding Harcourt's London connections. Agnes Blythe reported a small object near the hedge. Martha Pendlebury, anxious and secretive, possibly knowing more than admitted. Reverend Pendlebury, concerned but protective, attempting to maintain calm. Miss Marple reflected as she sipped her tea. There is a chain of cause and effect here, and one of these links is forged of intention rather than accident. Something has occurred, and the truth lies in the quiet moments, in the hesitations, the glances, the things left unspoken. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the vicarage garden, a sudden knock at the door startled the household. Florence Green hurried to answer. Standing on the doorstep, wrapped in a heavy coat and scarf, was a man Miss Marple had not expected to see in Stoke Haven. His arrival, she sensed, was certain to complicate matters further and perhaps provide the first clear hint of motive behind Edward Harcourt's fall. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself, the faint glimmer of anticipation in her eyes. Christmas Eve, she reflected, always brought surprises, and in Stoke Haven this year, a mystery that would require the utmost subtlety and observation to unravel. The evening fell over Stoke Haven like a soft grey blanket, the sky streaked with the pale violet of early winter twilight. Inside the vicarage, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm flickers across the polished oak floors and glinting silverware. Miss Marple sat quietly in the sitting-room, her knitting untouched in her lap, as the other inhabitants of the house and the unexpected visitor engaged in muted conversation. The man at the door, Mr. Philip Carraway, a solicitor from London, had arrived without warning, claiming urgent business regarding Mr. Harcourt's affairs. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with a trim beard and an air of authority. His eyes, however, betrayed a watchfulness that suggested he was measuring the room as carefully as the household was measuring him. Miss Marple's intuition immediately sensed that Carraway's presence was no mere formality. There was a tension in the air, a subtle shift, as though the vicarage itself held its breath. "Good evening, Reverend." Carraway said smoothly, "I understand Mr. Harcourt may have received correspondence that requires clarification. I hope I am not intruding on your holiday preparations." Reverend Pendlebury rose politely. "Mr. Carraway, you are most welcome. We were discussing Edward's unfortunate fall earlier. We trust you have come on professional matters only." Carraway's glance flicked toward Edward Harcourt, who was seated stiffly by the fire, and then to Martha Pendlebury, whose hands were folded tightly in her lap. "Precisely. I believe some matters cannot wait until after Christmas." Miss Marple observed quietly, noting Carraway's poised hands, the subtle tension in his jaw, and the faint creases around his eyes. There was an ease to his manner, yet she detected a hint of calculation, as though every word and gesture had been rehearsed. After Carraway had settled, Miss Marple quietly approached Edward. "You seem troubled," she remarked gently. "It is more than the fall, I presume." Edward hesitated. I received a letter regarding a family estate, matters of inheritance and legal complications I had hoped to resolve quietly, but this morning's incident, it has made me question who I can trust." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Trust is a delicate thing, particularly in a village where everyone knows each other's business, or thinks they do. Tell me, Edward, has anyone expressed envy or disapproval regarding your position or your inheritance?" Edward swallowed hard. "Perhaps. Captain Trench has always been distant, and Florence Green, well, she knows far too much for her own good, but no one has ever acted upon it, I hope." Miss Marple allowed the statement to settle in her mind. Subtle tensions often manifested as indirect actions rather than outright confrontations. She needed to examine these indirect actions carefully. Later that evening she requested a private word with Captain Trench. The retired officer, sitting by the window with his hands folded, acknowledged her silently. "Captain," Miss Marple began softly, "yesterday you mentioned the fall seemed too neat. May I ask what made you feel it was not purely accidental?" Trench's eyes met hers. "The angle of the fall, the position of the body, and the absence of any other footprints, and I noticed a faint scuff near the flower-bed. Something, or someone, must have caused it deliberately." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, that matches my own observations. Do you know of anyone who might have wished Mr. Harcourt harm, subtle as it may have been?" The captain shook his head. "Not openly, but grudges do exist, small resentments that fester unnoticed. I would not dismiss them entirely." As the evening deepened, Miss Marple turned her attention to Florence Green. The village gossip, always eager for information, could prove both a source of clues and a source of misdirection. "Florence," she said kindly, "I understand you have heard whispers regarding Edward Harcourt's business in London." Florence's eyes widened. "Oh, yes, but I hardly know where to begin. People have been saying he's involved in some questionable dealings, though what exactly, it's hard to tell. I've heard stories about old partnerships, arguments over property, and even some debts that were quietly settled." Miss Marple tapped her finger against her cup. "Stories can be misleading, Florence, but they often contain fragments of truth. Did anyone seem unusually concerned about Edward's affairs?" Florence hesitated. "Well, Mr. Carraway, perhaps. He arrived from London quite suddenly, and some say he was displeased with how matters were progressing. But I don't know for certain. It's all so confusing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, it can be. Confusion often serves as a convenient mask for truth." As the night wore on, Miss Marple took a brief moment to examine the vicarage library. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes, and a small writing desk occupied one corner. There she noticed a small envelope tucked behind a row of legal volumes. Curiously, it bore Edward Harcourt's initials. She opened it discreetly and found a note, hastily written. "I am watched too closely. Do not trust appearances. The fall was no accident." Her eyes narrowed. The warning confirmed her suspicions. Someone was manipulating events, and Edward himself was aware of it, though he had not revealed the full extent. The arrival of Philip Carroway that evening had introduced yet another layer of complexity. Miss Marple observed him quietly over tea, noting the faint glint of impatience in his eyes, the careful way he avoided drawing attention to certain documents, and the subtle, almost imperceptible glances toward both Edward and Martha Pendlebury. By now, Miss Marple had a clear sense of the initial suspects, their motives, and the tangled web of relationships. Edward Harcourt, anxious and vulnerable due to a letter and past London dealings, possibly targeted. Philip Carroway, recently arrived solicitor, authoritative and watchful, potential manipulator or observer of the unfolding tension. Captain Trench, distant but observant, may have grudges or hidden reasons to interfere. Florence Green, nosy and eager to share information, but her gossip can both illuminate and mislead. Martha Pendlebury, anxious, possibly withholding information, concerned about protecting her household. Reverend Pendlebury, concerned and protective, though perhaps naive to the undercurrents around him. Agnes Blythe, timid but perceptive, may have observed crucial details unnoticed by adults. As Miss Marple considered the pieces, the household was interrupted by a sudden, startling noise, a crash from the upper floor. Everyone rushed to the scene, discovering that a small statuette had fallen from a shelf in Edward Harcourt's room. The piece was shattered, revealing a hidden compartment within, containing a folded letter. Miss Marple carefully retrieved it and read its contents. The truth lies in the vicarage. One must act before the end of Christmas Eve, or all will be lost. The note was unsigned, yet the handwriting matched the envelope she had found earlier. Clearly, someone was leaving cryptic messages, warnings, perhaps, or deliberate attempts to provoke anxiety. The tension in the vicarage was palpable. Edward's shoulders stiffened as he read the note, and Martha's hands trembled slightly. Captain Trench's eyes darted between the two, and Florence Green whispered excitedly about hidden plots and dark intentions. Even Agnes Blythe looked uneasy, uncertain what the messages signified. Miss Marple, however, remained calm. She had seen such twists before, deliberate distractions meant to draw attention away from the true culprit. The falling statuette, the hidden letters, the sudden appearance of Mr. Carroway, all were pieces of a carefully orchestrated puzzle. She considered the most recent clues, the hidden letters suggesting a premeditated warning. The unexpected visitor from London, possibly with vested interest in Edward's affairs, the cryptic messages implying knowledge of events inside the vicarage, small discrepancies in everyone's accounts, footsteps, glances, and hesitations. One detail stood out sharply, the timing of Edward's fall in the garden, juxtaposed with the delivery of the first mysterious letter. The sequence suggested that someone had acted quickly and with precise knowledge of the vicarage's routines. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing thoughtfully, who knew the layout of the garden, Edward's habits, and the exact moment to instigate a fall. She pondered. The answer, she suspected, would come from observing behaviour rather than solely relying on documents. By late evening, the household had settled, though uneasily. The fire burned low, and shadows stretched across the sitting-room. Miss Marple reflected on the events of the day, hidden compartments, anonymous notes, unexplained falls, and the arrival of a stranger with a precise interest in Edward Harcourt's affairs. It was clear that the situation in Stoke Haven was more than a mere accident. Motives, opportunity, and subtle manipulations were all at play, woven together with the delicate threads of secrecy and fear. Miss Marple understood that the following hours would prove crucial. Someone in the vicarage, or among the visitors, held the key to the mystery, and the web of red herrings would soon need to be untangled. And as she observed the faces around her anxious, watchful, secretive, she knew that Christmas Eve had become far more than a holiday. It had become the stage upon which hidden truths would slowly, inevitably, reveal themselves. The following morning dawned pale and still over Stoke Haven, the frost on the rooftops glinting faintly as if powdered with diamonds. Inside the vicarage, the atmosphere was subdued, the household still tense from the events of the previous evening. The mysterious letters, the fall of Edward Harcourt, and the sudden arrival of Mr. Philip Carroway had left a tangible unease hanging in the rooms, like smoke from a long, extinguished candle. Miss Marple, however, was calm. Rising early, she took her customary walk around the vicarage, examining the garden paths and hedges in greater detail. Her sharp eyes noted the subtle depressions near the flower bed, the faint scuff marks, and the partially hidden footprints in the softened frost. Each detail, insignificant to an untrained eye, spoke volumes to her. Someone had known Edward's habits well enough to manipulate the scene of the fall. After breakfast, Miss Marple requested private conversations with each member of the household and visitors, intending to observe behaviour, words, and gestures closely. She began with Martha Pendlebury, who had remained anxious and fidgety since the incident. "Martha," Miss Marple began gently, "you have been unusually tense these past 2 days. I wonder if you might share what concerns you." Martha hesitated, glancing toward her husband. Reverend Pendlebury nodded slightly, silently granting permission. With a deep breath, she revealed a secret she had held since receiving Edward Harcourt's letter. "It is this," she admitted. "Years ago, Edward and my husband were involved in a land dispute with a distant cousin of ours. The matter was settled quietly, but Edward retained some knowledge. This morning's letter suggested that someone might be attempting to leverage that knowledge, perhaps to threaten him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "So the fall, the letters, all may be connected to past grievances rather than immediate malice." Martha's eyes widened. I suppose so, but I fear there is more to it than mere reminders of the past. Someone is determined to provoke fear or confusion." Next, Miss Marple spoke with Captain Trench, whose quiet observation often revealed hidden truths. "Captain," she said, "you were in the garden yesterday. You noticed the fall was unusual. Tell me, did you observe anyone acting suspiciously in the days prior?" Trench considered. "Edward has been careful, but I did notice a man from London, Carroway, asking too many questions, and Edward's manner suggested he feared interference. The garden is open, but the paths are known to him. Only someone aware of his routine could have staged the fall so precisely." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Exactly my thought. Someone used knowledge of the household to manipulate events." She then turned to Florence Green, who, despite her gossiping tendencies, often had sharp insights. "Florence," Miss Marple asked, "have you noticed any unusual interactions between Edward and our visitor, Mr. Carroway?" Florence nodded eagerly. "Yes, he watches Edward constantly, and I think Edward is trying to hide something from him. But Edward has been so secretive, I can hardly tell what is true and what is merely fear." Miss Marple considered all these observations. Her mind worked quietly, piecing together sequences of events, motives, and opportunity. Later that morning, she finally spoke with Edward Harcourt, who was still pale and uneasy. "Edward," she said, "I believe you know more than you admit. Please tell me exactly what you received in the letter." Edward hesitated, then spoke. "It was a warning, or a threat, I'm not sure which. Someone from London, Carroway, I presume, knows about the land dispute, and suggests that certain outcomes may follow if I do not comply with instructions. I feared for my safety. That is why I was distracted in the garden, and why I feel my fall may not have been entirely accidental. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, distraction can be created intentionally, and fear is a powerful tool. At this moment she recalled Agnes Blythe's observation of a small object near the flower-bed. Returning to the garden, Miss Marple found a tiny fragment of paper partially concealed beneath frost-laden leaves. Upon inspection, it was a torn piece of the original letter, which had been dropped or kicked aside during the staged fall. The handwriting matched that of Carraway, confirming her suspicion that he had been directly involved in unsettling Edward. Miss Marple gathered the household in the sitting-room, careful to observe their expressions. "I believe we can now piece together the sequence of events," she said. "Mr. Harcourt's fall was not a mere accident. Someone, aware of his habits and the lay-out of the garden, created a situation that caused him to stumble." The household exchanged nervous glances. Captain Trench's eyes narrowed. Florence Green leaned forward in anticipation, and Martha Pendlebury clutched her husband's arm. Miss Marple continued. "The letters, the fall, and the visitor from London are all connected. Someone sought to intimidate Edward Harcourt, using his knowledge of past disputes to manipulate him. The object in the garden, missed by all but Agnes, was evidence left unintentionally, and the hidden letters and messages were intended to heighten fear and confusion." Philip Carraway shifted uncomfortably. I am a solicitor. I merely came to discuss Edward's affairs." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Yes, Mr. Carraway, and yet your involvement is more than professional courtesy. You understood Edward's routine. You arranged for his fall to occur in such a manner that it appeared accidental, and you left letters to provoke anxiety. The motive is financial. You wish to exert control over his affairs using threats of exposure of past disputes." Carraway's face paled. You cannot prove anything." Miss Marple smiled faintly, the calm precision of her reasoning filling the room. "Proof, my dear sir, often lies not in accusation alone, but in observation of behaviour, consistency of actions, and the subtle traces one leaves behind. The fragment of your letter, the timing of your arrival, the discrepancies in your account, these form a chain that cannot be denied." Edward exhaled, relief flooding his features. "So, it was Carraway." "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed, "and the fall in the garden was staged to frighten you. Your own caution and the letter's warning prevented serious injury, but the intent was clear." Captain Trench's hand relaxed from the window ledge. Florence Green clapped her hands lightly, and Martha Pendlebury allowed herself a small sigh of relief. Reverend Pendlebury nodded solemnly. Miss Marple turned to the household. "It is remarkable how ordinary events, letters, small objects, cautious walks, can be manipulated, and yet careful observation, patience, and understanding human behaviour allow us to uncover the truth." Philip Carraway, realizing his plan had been unravelled, made no further protest. The police, called discreetly by Reverend Pendlebury, were en route to take a statement and remove him from the premises. Edward Harcourt, still shaken, expressed his gratitude. "Miss Marple, your insight, I cannot thank you enough. I feared a simple fall might conceal something far darker, and you have revealed the truth without harm." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No thanks are needed, Edward. One must always observe carefully, particularly in a village where appearances are deceiving, and intentions are hidden behind civility. A slip, a note, or a glance may tell far more than words alone." With the truth now revealed, the household slowly returned to calm. The tension that had pervaded the vicarage lifted slightly, though the memory of fear lingered. Miss Marple herself remained quiet, reflecting on human nature, subtle manipulation, and the small acts that could conceal or reveal intentions. She glanced out at the garden, where frost still clung to the hedges. Even in a peaceful village such as Stoke Haven, she reflected, danger could be subtle, hidden behind the gentlest of surfaces. And yet, careful observation and thoughtful reasoning could illuminate the truth. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the vicarage, Miss Marple sipped her tea once more, content to watch the household relax and trust restored. For now the mystery was resolved, and Stokehaven could breathe a quiet sigh of relief, though the lessons of vigilance and human nature would remain in their minds. The last vestiges of daylight had faded from Stokehaven when Miss Marple gathered the household once more in the sitting-room. The fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows over the polished oak floors and gleaming silverware. Outside, the wind rustled through the bare branches of the yew trees, a faint reminder that winter still held the countryside in its grip. Inside, however, there was a sense of anticipation, as if the household itself were waiting for justice to be spoken aloud. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, knitting in hand, but her sharp blue eyes swept over each of the assembled villagers and visitors. The room was quiet except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft ticking of a wall clock. Reverend Pendlebury sat rigidly on the edge of his chair, hands clasped, while Martha Pendlebury's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. Captain Trench leaned back with arms folded, Florence Green perched at the edge of her seat, eager yet tense, and Edward Harcourt sat with a faint pallor, still recovering from the shock of the staged fall. Philip Carraway stood near the door, his composure beginning to crack under the weight of scrutiny. Miss Marple cleared her throat gently. "We are gathered here to untangle the events that have disturbed Stokehaven during this otherwise peaceful Christmas Eve. What we have witnessed, the fall in the garden, the letters, the hidden messages, and the sudden arrival of Mr. Carraway are not isolated occurrences. They are connected, and the connections reveal a carefully plotted attempt to intimidate one individual. That individual, of course, is Edward Harcourt." Edward flinched slightly but nodded. Miss Marple continued, her voice measured and calm. "Now let us consider the facts. Yesterday Edward fell in the garden, sustaining a minor injury but avoiding serious harm. The fall appeared accidental to all but a trained observer, yet there were several indicators that it was deliberate: the faint scuff near the flower-bed, the precise timing of his steps, and the absence of any other footprints besides those of Edward and the household. Furthermore, the small object noted by Agnes Blythe was found, partially concealed beneath the frost, confirming that someone had manipulated the scene. Then there were the letters. One delivered to Edward by post, another found hidden within a statuette in his room. Both letters were written in the same hand, and both served to create fear and uncertainty. And finally, the arrival of Mr. Philip Carraway, a solicitor from London, whose knowledge of Edward's affairs was far too precise to be coincidental. Miss Marple paused to let her words sink in. Carraway's posture stiffened, and his eyes darted toward Edward, who sat rigidly. "Mr. Carraway," Miss Marple said, "your involvement is undeniable. You had knowledge of Edward Harcourt's family affairs, particularly regarding a distant land dispute that had been settled years ago. You sought to leverage this knowledge to control him, employing fear, misdirection, and physical manipulation. The fall in the garden was staged, designed to appear accidental while ensuring that Edward would be sufficiently startled to question his own safety. The letters were carefully composed to reinforce this anxiety. Carraway opened his mouth, but Miss Marple raised a finger gently. "Do not attempt to speak yet. Consider the pattern of events, the fall, the hidden letter, the messages within the vicarage, and your own timing." Each act was deliberate, each calculated to provoke fear and compel Edward's compliance. And yet your plan failed, for Edward's awareness, coupled with the attentive observations of others, particularly Agnes Blythe, ensured that the intent was discovered. Captain Trench's deep voice broke the silence. "Well, I'll be damned." I suspected the fall was deliberate, but I did not imagine the extent. Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed, Captain, it is often the case that small actions, misplaced letters, a slight scuff, a carefully chosen word, reveal intentions far greater than the perpetrator imagines." In this instance, Mr. Carraway relied upon fear as a tool, not realizing that keen observation, patience, and reasoning could unravel the web he had spun. Edward finally spoke, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. "So, it was all Carraway, the fall, the letters, the notes hidden in my room. He intended to frighten me, perhaps even manipulate me into signing documents or yielding control of the estate." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely. Your instincts were correct, Edward, though the evidence was subtle. Often, in small villages such as Stoke Haven, one must observe human behaviour closely, noting discrepancies and hesitations to discern the truth. Martha Pendlebury, her hands folded, spoke quietly. But why? Why would he do such a thing on Christmas Eve, of all times? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "Timing, my dear Martha, was a part of the plan. Christmas Eve is a time of distraction, when people are preoccupied with festivities, with charity and goodwill." Mr. Carraway calculated that the holiday would create a natural cover for his actions. Yet it is precisely during such occasions that observant minds, like yours, like Edward's, can detect irregularities that others might overlook. Florence Green, unable to contain herself, leaned forward. "But how did you know it was Carraway, Miss Marple?" There were so many misleading clues, letters, the statuette, even the hints from Martha. I thought it might have been Captain Trench or someone else entirely. Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Ah, Florence, that is the nature of red herrings. Villagers, and indeed most people, create layers of distraction, misleading signs, misdirected suspicion. My observations, however, focused on consistency, opportunity, and subtle behavioral cues. Carraway's actions aligned with knowledge only he could possess. His arrival, his timing, and the physical evidence left behind, such as the scuff marks and the hidden letter, revealed his intent. The others, while involved in minor distractions or concealing their own anxieties, did not manipulate events deliberately. Captain Trench spoke again, his voice slightly softer than usual. So the game was in the details. The letters, the garden, the timing. All small things, but they added up. "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "Crimes often appear complex, but they are revealed in their simplicity, through human behaviour, habitual routines, and small, observable acts." Reverend Pendlebury stood, placing a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder. "I am grateful, Miss Marple, that you have uncovered this before anyone was truly harmed. Christmas Eve could have been spoiled entirely had the situation escalated further." Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. "Indeed, Reverend. But now the truth is known, and justice will be served. Mr. Carraway's motives, while perhaps understandable in the realm of ambition and greed, do not excuse his actions." At this point, a knock sounded at the front door. It was the local constable, called discreetly by Reverend Pendlebury earlier. He entered, and, upon Miss Marple's confirmation, took Carraway aside, who was now resigned to his fate. Statements were taken, and arrangements were made for Carraway's removal to London for questioning and further legal proceedings. With the immediate threat removed, the vicarage settled into a quieter rhythm. The fire burned more brightly, the scent of pine and holly filled the rooms, and the household allowed itself a sense of relief. Edward Harcourt, though still pale, smiled faintly as he sipped his tea, reassured by the knowledge that the danger had passed. Miss Marple, observing all this, reflected on human nature and the subtle mechanisms of deceit. She mused quietly to herself, Greed, fear, and ambition often masquerade behind civility and decorum, yet human behavior, carefully observed, always reveals the truth in the end. Later in the afternoon, the household gathered for a modest Christmas celebration. Mince pies, plum pudding, and fragrant tea adorned the dining table. Carol singing was attempted, though with occasional laughter and gentle teasing at the previous day's events. Even Captain Trench, usually reserved, allowed himself a small smile, and Florence Green recounted the morning's revelations with unabashed delight. Martha Pendlebury moved among her guests with composure, though Miss Marple noticed her occasional glances toward her husband and Edward. The vicar himself, stoic but relieved, guided the proceedings with gentle humour. Agnes Blythe, shy and quiet, was praised for her attention to detail, her observant eyes having spotted the small object that ultimately confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. The girl's pride and relief were evident in her flushed cheeks and sparkling eyes. Miss Marple herself remained quietly observant, occasionally knitting and sipping her tea, her mind cataloguing the sequence of events, the personalities involved, and the subtle cues that had revealed the culprit. As dusk settled over Stoke Haven, Miss Marple stepped briefly onto the vicarage porch, breathing in the cold air and watching the village rooftops glint under the first stars. She considered the events of the past 2 days, a carefully staged fall, cryptic letters, manipulations of fear, and the eventual unravelling of the plot. Even in the quietest villages, she reflected, human nature presented mysteries. They were rarely violent or overt, often cloaked in courtesy, secrecy, and misdirection, and yet, with patience, observation, and gentle reasoning, the truth could always be discovered. Returning inside, she allowed herself a small smile as the household settled around the fire. Stoke Haven had endured an unexpected disturbance, but justice had been served. Peace, fragile yet sincere, returned to the vicarage, and Miss Marple, ever perceptive, sipped her tea and mused quietly, as she often did. One must never underestimate the ingenuity of human mischief, nor the simplicity of truth. Even in a village as tranquil as Stoke Haven, the ordinary reveals the extraordinary if one only observes with care. With that, the household finally relaxed into Christmas Eve, their laughter mingling with the crackling fire, and the village returned to its peaceful winter stillness, at least for now.